So this was supposed to be a combined lecture on common data elements with a brief introduction and then patient-reported outcome measures. But you're going to get a whole webinar on common data elements. Common data elements are, some of the patient-reported outcomes are common data elements, but when you're designing a trial, it's important to look at those for comparison from study to study, and you'll hear a whole discussion on that. Chris mentioned that they've used common data elements in NeuroNext trials too. So this is the first time I've given this talk without Brett Casella. So those of you who so the faculty have been in this course before, you know, Brett and I always tag team this, and it just doesn't seem right going to the PROM without Brett Casella, who was kind enough to like Photoshop my head, sort of. but the truth is that I never went to PROM, and this is why I never went to PROM. This is probably how I was dressed for PROM. So we're going to talk about patient-reported outcome measures, and I'm going to give a little bit of a background about why they're important, and then the science on how to develop patient-reported outcome measures, and then just a couple examples from real life. One of which is Brett's example, which I am using with the clinician, and the other is one that I'm more familiar with. So the rationale and definition is that patient-reported outcome measures are patient-reported outcome measures. So they're a crucial element for clinical care. So we use patient-reported outcome measures in our clinical settings, but they can be quality performance for management. So institutions sometimes use them, but they're also important for clinical research. And it's direct for patient reporting regarding their health condition and their treatment. So it has to do with their symptoms, their functional status, and then also there's health-related quality of life, which is more widespread than just what their specific disease is. And there's some generic patient-reported outcome measures, and there are some that are very disease-specific. So a patient-reported outcome is not a proxy reporting measure. By definition, you can't have somebody else reporting what the patient is feeling. They have to do it themselves. And it's not an observer-reported measurement, so it's not something that you can observe yourself. But it is a way to get useful information for clinical care or for research. And it can be very useful in combination with other non-patient-reported outcome measures. So they may be one of your endpoints in a series of different endpoints. And it's a report of symptoms or a health state, and you can use it to measure quality of life. And they're based on theoretical frameworks, and you can usually they have multiple domains typically in them. So using patient-reported outcome measures only as your endpoint is not a good idea, but it certainly is helpful and is actually looked upon favorably in some studies, since the question is, that number may have changed, the slope may have changed on the ALS functional rating scale, but what does it really mean to the patient, right? Does the patient really know any difference, or you've got a difference on the pain scale, but the patient is still not able to go back to work. So what is the role of the patient in patient-reported outcomes? So in clinical care, as I said, it's one way for the patient to quickly communicate important information so they can do them ahead of time. So we have short time in our clinical visits. They do these forms, you take a look at them, it's a scale, you can see where they fall on the scale. Do I need to address this question of depression is the common one that we think about? Do I need to address depression with my patient today? They score well on the quick patient-reported outcome measure. That's not an issue you need to address in the 15 to 20-minute patient appointment that you have with them for return. In research, it can get you information that's otherwise hard to obtain. So, for example, we're going to talk about a spasticity patient-reported outcome measure. It's hard to measure reliably in the clinic. There are scales, but there's a lot of variability, and it's hard for people to characterize. And you can also get it via the electronic health record or on a written form. So people can sometimes do them before they come into the research appointment, They can do them while they're sitting and waiting between different other parts of the clinical research visit. Health-related quality of life measures are not routinely assessed, so we don't usually do those in a clinical setting, but they can really matter. They are considered a valid and meaningful endpoint for research. There are several of them out there that can be quite useful, and they can give you an important clinical perspective that ties, as I said, to patient satisfaction with the other measures that you're using. So health-related quality of life measures have a whole variety of components to them, and this is what I mean by multiple domains. So they look at physical. There are questions that look at physical things in quality of life, psychological, social, economical. Their disease symptoms are part of that. Their whole cultural setup, treatment. So there's lots of different factors that go into health-related quality of life measures. So some examples of patient-reported outcome measures are for symptoms of depression, we have the PHQ-9, PHQ-2, which is a really truncated version, 2 questions as opposed to 9 questions. Health-related quality of life measures, there's some generic ones that you may be familiar with. There are also some disease-specific ones, so the stroke-specific quality of life measures is listed here. There's also, health index, myotonic dystrophy health index. There are several of these that are now been developed. And then there's the patient-reported outcomes measurement information system, so PROMIS. And some of you may be familiar with that and may be looking at using some. This was initiated by NIH in the late 2004. It was a multi-center cooperative group. Their goal was to build and validate common, accessible item banks to measure key symptoms and health concepts that are applicable to a range of chronic conditions. And they use patient-reported outcomes. And the result of that is, this is accessible, and I would suggest that you look these up. If you're thinking of using quality of life measures, is the NeuroQual, which you can use. It's open access, and also in the NIH toolbox, there are several quality of life measures that came out of this. There's also some computerized adaptive testing tools that you can tailor for individual assessments. And the key thing is about quality of life measures, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, is that once they've been developed and validated, some of them you can't change the format in which you give them, because then you bias, or you may change the results or lose the validity or reliability of the testing. So some of these adaptive testings allow you to change the measurements somewhat. So what happens is, this is kind of the conceptual framework. So when you're developing your instrument, you say, what's the concept, what do you want to look at? You have to think about the different domains that you're going to look at, and then you usually have more than one item for each domain. And the domain meaning, so you want to look at the economical impact of the patient's disease, or you may want to look at the depression. You can't just ask one question, right? You have to look at several. You have to have several items and see if they correlate. And then your endpoint model would be to say, okay, I have a disease, and then I want to give a treatment, and what I'm going to look at in my study is I'm going to look at some biochemical tests. I'm going to look at the physical exam, some physical findings, and then I'm going to use what are the symptoms and how does the patient perceive the effect of my treatment to their disease. And so this is the model that I'm talking about that can be very useful when you want to have several endpoints. You would not use just this as you would not use just the symptoms of the disease as the only endpoint measure. So the issue is that FDA became very interested in how people were using patient-reported outcome measures, and in 2009 they published some guidance for this, and this is at the end of the talk, but also in the list of readings to look at the guidance that they have. The guidance was that you have to focus on what matters to the patient. And again, this goes back to the thing that the point that I made earlier, that you don't really just because you see a change in a number on a scale doesn't mean that it really affects the patient in any particular way. And so you get this information directly from the patient. You don't interpret it yourself. The information is what the patient gives you. And you have to have, FDA says you have to have documentation that patient input had when you're developing. So if you're developing a new instrument, you can't say, well, I think this is probably what my patient would be concerned about. With myotonic dystrophy is, okay, so the patient needs to have more energy. And so, so I think, well, if the patient can go out and do the grocery shopping because they have more energy 3 times a week, that's probably, a question I would ask, I can now go out and go grocery shopping 3 times a week, when in reality, if you talk to my patients in the myotonic dystrophy clinic, they don't really care to go out grocery shopping. They don't care. They're happy sitting on the couch. They actually are, who cares about that is the caregiver and the physician, right? The patient thinks their quality of life is actually pretty good sitting on the couch, and they're not concerned that they can't go to the grocery store. So development in the myotonic dystrophy health index and quality of life index was very important to have the patients involved in the development of that and what was important to them to see get better. And then the FDA says you have to document that they also show that the instrument performed the actual performance of the instrument. So to the FDA, the important thing is that there was patient involvement in the development and how you utilize this quality of life instrument. So it's an iterative process, so they want to see that you started working on it and you tested it with patients, you got patient input, and you went back and you built it again and you did it. And then once you develop your patient-reported outcome measures, if you change them at all, there's a whole table from the FDA guidance that I'm just going to pop up here, but it shows you that there are very specific things that you have to do if you're going to change any of these. And if you change them, you better, and you're thinking about taking your treatment to the FDA, you better justify ahead of time why you changed them and have the FDA review them. So this is the guidance. You have to show that the methods of assessment are well-defined and reliable, so that how you are giving the patient the instrument, you do it, you're either always going to have them do it at home, or you're always going to have them do it in the waiting room, or you're going to have to do it in a specific setting, and that you need to, in your protocol for the study and the report of the results, you have to explain that the variables were measured, etc. So this is the table that they use that shows that what kind of reasons you would want to change or delete something from a patient-reported outcome measure. And essentially, you want to say that as you're building your outcome measure, is it relevant? Is it relevant to the target population? So let's say a treatment comes along that changes the course of the disease significantly, then perhaps there's something you want to change in the patient-reported outcome measure because it's no longer an issue for those particular patients. Is your range for response wide enough? Do you capture the full spectrum of it, or is it too narrow? You're not getting a spread across the scale. Everything's getting clustered, so that might make you change your responses. Is there too much? Is there not enough variability in the answering? So every patient who has a stroke in the a left MCA stroke, they all give the exact same answer. So it's not a useful tool in that particular area. Are they reproducible? Sorry. Is there correlation between different items? So if you have several items that are looking at a particular domain, do they correlate? And are they sensitive? And if they're not, so these are reasons why you might change. I'm not going to continue to go through all of these. You can take a look at the slides themselves online. And then when the FDA reviews your use of the patient-reported outcome measures for a particular treatment, you want to be able to show that it was reliable, that you've shown validity through different populations of your, or different uses of it, and that it will detect change over time. Either if it's not in a treatment, if you're doing a natural history, that it will detect change over time as the disease progresses, or if you do some type of intervention, that it can detect change in the intervention. So there are lots of different response option types. You can use, a visual analog scale. You can use a Likert scale. You can use a pictorial scale. And then the other thing that the FDA guidance talks about is respondent and administrator burden. So what's the length of the questionnaire? Is it really long and no one's ever going to get to the last 15 questions? Or is the interview fatiguing for the patient? They ask, literally, look at what's the font size? Like, can you read this slide? But, is the font size, is the formatting a way that is, easy to read? And are there new instructions with each item? And do you need to consult the records? Does somebody need to consult their records to complete this item? Like, does somebody need to say, are you asking questions, historical questions? And then, is there privacy when they do it? Is their caregiver going to have to be with them? Is it in a quiet setting where they're alone, or is as they're filling it out, is the research coordinator standing there, kind of like doing this? It's time to go and do your MRI scan or your PET scan. So do they have the privacy to complete it? And the same thing about inadequate time. And then, is the literacy level too high? Are there questions that patients are unwilling to answer, and then are they allowed to skip those questions? And then what's the perception that, so you don't want, then does the interviewer, if it's an interview as opposed to a written thing, you have to make sure that the interviewer is trained to ask the questions in a specific way that doesn't lead the participant to perceive that they want a specific answer. So you have to show that if it's an interview type of thing, you have to show that you've trained people to ask the questions in a particular way that doesn't elicit some type of bias or expectancy from the person who's being interviewed. And then again, do they need physical help to complete it? So again, if you modify it, if you go from paper to electronic, that makes a difference. By electronic to paper, some quality of life measures, if you change the type of paper, if you copy it, if it's a different color, all those kind of things can actually change the validity. It's interesting. So any kind of modification that you make, you have to justify to the FDA. And then if you're using it in your clinical trial design, it's all the things that we talk about with design and analysis and the use of endpoints and everything that Jeremy talked about earlier about outcome measures. All of that applies to the use of patient-reported outcome measures as well. And the FDA has specific concerns written in their guidance if you're going to use electronics. So how do you develop a patient-reported outcome measure? This is a figure from one of the articles. It talks about you go from, what's the framework all the way to, as I said, it's a sort of an iterative process. So I have some examples from real life. And again, my first example comes from Brett, so I just know that he would be upset with me. So I had to put in the slide to say that he's here in spirit and not using the force. It's a long day. So Brett had in his clinic, was using depression screening in his stroke clinic. And there was a paper form, the patient filled it out, he screened it on 2 major symptoms and looked at, did he need to address depression or not. He could easily enter it into the electronic medical record. There was a template that existed, a dot phrase. And so then he got a K23, and he wanted to look at outcome and quality of life after a diabetic stroke, and he used multiple measures, and he used SF36, and stroke-specific quality of life, and all sorts of different things, and his nurse coordinator was like mutinied and said, I am not doing all these measures, this takes a long time, the patients are exhausted by the end, I'm not sure, after you do a whole series of these, if it's as valid, the first one is as valid as the last one. So he said, really what I'm interested in is I'm interested in spasticity after stroke. And so he decided he was going to develop a spasticity screening tool. Part of this was funded by Allergan because he was doing work with Botox for post-spasticity, and they didn't have a good screening tool. And it's, spasticity is the velocity-dependent increase in muscle tone, kind of a vague term. People talk about stiffness. And so he thought, well, if I could get people to tell me what they felt, like what kind of questions would I ask them? So none of the two measures that he had that were listed here, the Ashworth scale, the modified Ashworth scale, none of them would be good for screening. Do you have spasticity or not? And so he wanted an easy tool that patients could self-identify and say, these are my symptoms, and then he could get treatment earlier in these patients rather than later. So he had to figure out what are the understandable terms for spasticity. So what do the patients say? What would a patient feel if they felt spasticity? And it had to apply to all limbs, arms and legs. And maybe if spasticity is spasticity, so across multiple diseases. Are we talking about stroke? We're talking about cerebral palsy. We're talking about in ALS. Could you use this in multiple diseases? And then what are the domains of interest? So is it pain? How does it hinder my activities of daily living? How does it hinder my mobility? And so he set up essentially a Delphi process, and so he did a survey, and they did re-ranking after getting anonymized results. He put together a group of people to try to design this tool. Then they came to a consensus, and they took the final scale. They had 11 panel members. They took 47 items that they thought would be referable to spasticity, narrowing them down to 13, and then they thought that shorter was better. So they felt that when they got to the 13 items, that they felt they got signs and symptoms of spasticity worked out, and how it might impact function and quality of life. So then they went to patient interviews. So they took 20 patients across 5 different disease states. 10 out of the 13 items interpreted as intended by greater than 90%, and the other 3 items were 80 to 85% correctly interpreted. They made slight modifications, and examples were added to several of the questions to explain the terms a little bit better, and they came up with a spasticity screening tool, which has since been published by Brett, and it is a useful tool to use. So then the next steps are validation. So they're going to assess internal consistency and sort of retest reliability across different centers and in the same patient. So all the things that you would do to develop any other type of endpoint measure, do the same kind of things in patient-reported outcome measures. The CMT Neuropathy Score is another is a mixture of a patient-reported outcome measure as well as some clinical measures. And so this is kind of an interesting tool. So CMT is hereditary neuropathies, slowly progressive. They change over time very slowly. So the clinical exam, the electrophysiology, is not very useful for looking for treatment, for response to treatment. And so developing meaningful outcome measures were really important because we've gotten to the point where there actually are going to be clinical trials of treatment, and you didn't have any good endpoint measures for these people. The neuropathy impairment score is based on is a tool that's commonly used, but it's based on exam findings, and its reproducibility is very good when you train the people on it, so that's good, it's valid, but it's not sensitive enough to change to be able to use it. So the International Neuropathy Consortium put together all their natural history data. They decided they had targets for treatment, and they wanted to initiate trials. They put together focus groups with patients to help develop the patient-reported outcome measures. And the questions that were asked were so they started right off with the patients, what was important to the patient, what did they note changed over time, what did the patients notice that changed over time. And then they developed a series of questionnaires. And eventually, they were able to develop a tool, the CMT Neuropathy Score. And this was done in a series of CMT patients across the spectrum of disease and different types of CMT. And this was published by Mike Scheib, who's my colleague at the University of Iowa, and felt to be a good measure of disability in patients. So then there was a mouse model looking at ascorbic acid and CMT1A in mice, showed that it improved demyelination. So there were large multi-center trials with CMT1A in the US and another one in the UK and Italy. And they used the CMT neuropathy score, and the outcomes were negative for all the studies. All three of the studies had negative outcomes. There was no change. And what they found was that when they looked back, using the CMT neuropathy score, their placebo group actually did better than the historical controls, where they were doing the natural history data collection, which is not something that is unfamiliar probably to people in this group. But because of that, they were looking at the floor and the ceiling based on historical controls and what they were expecting to see in improvement. And the placebo group did actually too well. And they found that their scale had significant floor and ceiling effects, and they needed to, it wasn't sensitive enough to, even with the patient-reported outcome measures. So they went back, they revisited it, they developed a second, they put in different questions for the patients. They changed the scale to a certain extent. And again, this is sort of the iterative process. So they went back, made some small but significant changes. They developed a script for the interviewer. So previously the interviewer just asked the question. Now the interviewer had to follow a script to specifically ask, specifically ask the questions about buttons. Do you have difficulty with buttons? But it couldn't just be, do you have trouble with buttons? It had to be a very specific way of asking about what type of problems with you had with buttons, so that you didn't bias the patient, so you didn't make assumptions for the patient. You had to really get the patient to give you that specific information. And they used a picture for people to say, you say, how high does the loss of feeling go in your leg? And they'd say, oh, well, maybe, about just above my ankle. Now you have to look at a picture and you say, point at this picture and show me how high it goes. And that standardized it enough to get you a cleaner response. And so this is what the score, the CMT neuropathy score looks like, and what you can see, maybe. Can you see the mouse? No? Okay, so what you can see is the top three are really the symptoms, and those are reported by the patient, they're scripted by the interviewer, and how you ask them, and it became a much more valid tool and a better measure for change. So this was now represented as a patient-reported outcome measure for clinical trials at the FDA. What's interesting is that the patient-reported outcome measures are actually more reliable than the sensory exam that gets recorded by the physician. So there's, as far as inter and intra-rater discrepancy, there's a higher discrepancy in the sensory exam. So the tuning fork, pinprick sensation, which we all know is, got some variability to it, but actually the patient-reported outcome measures were more reproducible than our sensory exam. So I don't know what that says about peripheral neurology. It's where I live, so. Anyway, so this is, as you can see, it can be complicated and it can be iterative, and sometimes you're lucky and you get to the, you develop your patient-reported outcome measure and you don't have to go back to the drawing board. But even now, for the CMT Neuropathy Score version 2, they found that they've actually gone back and revalidated it again and have changed it again as we are about to enter into some other clinical trials. But there's a lot of work in developing these tools. So one of the things I would say is when you look at the common data elements and you hear the topic of common data elements and you go and you look under the common data elements about quality of life tools, or you look at the NeuroQual, it's probably better, unless there's something extremely unusual about whatever you're studying, to try to use something that has been clearly validated and used in other studies, and to stick with that than to try to develop your own patient-reported outcome measure. And so this is from the PROMIS website, and this is the NeuroQual, which I encourage you to look at. And then just because I'm, a nonconformist, and so I'm going to end it.
In terms of picking a qual measure, I understand that your arguments against trying to develop your own, and that makes a lot of sense. But there are more disease-specific quality of life measures. Can you comment on the advantages of using a more disease-specific one, like a quality versus the NeuroQual?
It depends on what you want to compare your results to. I think disease-specific, and it also depends on your disease. So there are some of the disease-specific quality of life measures have been used a lot, and those are probably good ones, like the stroke-specific quality of life measure, and those are probably good ones to use. It also depends on what question you're trying to answer. Does that make sense? But I think if you can use a disease-specific, so for example, some of the more generic ones might not make modifications for the fact that you can't use your hands anymore, or that, so the question might not address that specifically, or they might not address, you might have motor function, but you don't have sensory function, so you have sensory loss, and so the question might be answered differently depending on whether you were dealing with a disorder that you couldn't use your hands because you didn't have sensation in your hands, or you couldn't use your hands as well because you didn't have motor function. So like like in the CMT score, the button question is just one of the questions that we ask, and the button difficulty could be because of sensory difficulties, or it could be because of motor difficulties. So then you have other domains that kind of weed out which one it is. Is it motor function, or is it sensory dysfunction? Does that make sense? I can't see you anymore because Will's right in front of you.
I don't want to
Really? You're a better door than you are a window.
Laurie, that was a great talk. Thank you. I have a question about and this may be a naive question about patient-reported outcome measures, but I don't have a good sense if the ones that we use in peripheral neurology are all FDA approved. Are most of the patient-reported outcome measures that are used in clinical trials FDA approved, and can you apply for a clinical trial without using one that's used by the FDA?
So it's not necessarily FDA approved. I mean, you have to, if you're going to do a trial and you're going to you want to use that trial to get FDA approval for a treatment, you need to make sure that the FDA considers it a valid tool. That's what it is. Because their tools are getting developed all the time. It's not that the FDA approves drugs and devices, but they don't approve the tools. You may decide that the tool, along with whatever your other endpoint measures, is important. But there is a little bit more emphasis now on, is it meaningful to the patient? that's great that you made their nerve conduction studies a little bit faster, but the patient still has burning and tingling in their feet, and so it didn't make them any better. Right?
So, again, wonderful talk. As you were saying at the start, when you were talking about individuals where, you know, it doesn't really matter too much for their quality of life because they don't mind about going out to the shops or something else like that. I guess the difficulty with each of these measures is that you then have a different circumstance. If you're there on your own, you have no family, being unable to, again, you don't have a lot of money, being unable to go to the shops is a big deal.
Right.
Whereas if you have a lot of family support, there's lots of, you know, ways that you can counterbalance whatever difficulties or functional disability that you have. Turning that functional disability, having a spouse who's completely normal and functioning, you can get around a lot of things that ordinarily you, as a single individual, would otherwise have to do. So,
So that's why sometimes the health indexes are a little bit more, because they take up more of that domain. What's your cultural setting? What's your economical setting? So I'll give you the example. So I think some of you are familiar with the development of the myotonic dystrophy health index that was done by Chad Heatwall and several others at Rochester. And that health index, is a good measurement and correlates well with the clinical findings in the patient. But when they did just a separate quality of life measure for people with myotonic dystrophy, what they found was that as the disease progressed, their quality of life measure actually improved. Patients actually felt like their life was better. And this is an interesting population, the myotonic dystrophy population is a very interesting population that I've been studying for a while, but so the quality of life measure, as you pointed out, really didn't measure, they felt like life was good. And so it's a little contradictory, but when you look at the whole health index, it actually showed a little bit the difference, because the questions that you were asking about quality of life didn't necessarily take in whole health index.
And again, that's something that comes up with even non-patient-reported outcome measures, things like the modified Rankin scale. If you had pre-stroke migraines, headaches are considered, would get you from a 0. If you had migraines after stroke, that would take you from a modified Rankin of 0 to 1 because you're having some symptoms. If you didn't have headaches before, but if that was a pre-existing thing, this same headaches wouldn't be moving you to that state. So sometimes very little things can change things in very subtle ways. And as I like to say, if I had a stroke and I could, it affected my cognitive processing, it might not be very good on stroke call anymore in terms of determining whether people are eligible for TTA, but I could still suture. And as an emergency medicine doc, if suturing was the main thing I was doing, it may not be a disabling deficit to have a processing problem. Like skin cut needs fixed, right? It's a different. Not meaning to throw proceduralists under the bus there, but there's sort of a different thing. Deciding to do the suturing, maybe I wouldn't be so good about that. I'd sort of suture everything, even things I could put back together. But again, a lot of those things can be highly contextual.